All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a pretty intense chapter of World War II history,
Yeah.
Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan.
Right.
And we're going to be looking at this through the lens of an episode of the American History Hit podcast.
Okay.
They interviewed military historian Dennis McGine Greco, who wrote the book Hell to Pay, Operation Downfall, and the Invasion of Japan, 1945 to 1947.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, this one hits close to home for me because my own father was stationed in the Philippines
Oh, wow.
getting ready for this invasion.
Yeah. That must make this history even more personal for you then. And
Yeah.
we're talking about a massive operation here.
Yeah.
This was the largest amphibious invasion ever planned.
It's mind-boggling to even try to imagine it.
Right.
So picture this.
Okay.
It's late spring 1945. Victory in Europe has been declared.
Right.
But the war in the Pacific is still raging on. And the U.S. is gearing up for this invasion of the Japanese home islands.
Uh-huh.
And the predictions are grim.
Grim is an understatement, I think.
Yeah.
They were expecting casualties on a scale unlike anything seen before.
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea.
Okay.
By June 1944, the U.S. Army was averaging 65,000 casualties
Wow.
every single month.
Every month.
Deaths, injuries, you name it.
Jeez.
By early 1945, the draft had to be cranked up to 100,000 inductions per month
Wow.
just to keep up with the projected losses for this invasion.
That's just, it's hard to even grasp those numbers.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder what even consider invading
Yeah.
when the cost seemed so high.
Well, the American mindset at the time was really focused on this unconditional surrender. Many saw it as the only way to truly end the war and prevent Japan from rising up again later.
Yeah. You know, it's important to remember the shadow of World War I was still looming large, right?
Yeah.
The Versailles Treaty, which ended that war.
Right. Was seen by many as a failure that ultimately led to Hitler's rise.
Yeah.
So this time around, the U.S. was determined to occupy Japan and really reshape it.
Yeah.
Unlike what had happened with Germany after World War I.
So it was this thinking of finish this decisively no matter the cost.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to put it.
But how did they even begin to plan an invasion of that magnitude?
Well, the planning for Operation Downfall actually began much earlier than many people think.
Really?
As early as spring 1944.
Wow.
That's even before D-Day in Europe.
Oh, wow.
So while the focus was on defeating Germany,
Right.
the threat of Japan was already being taken very seriously.
So they're planning two massive wars simultaneously.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
It's pretty amazing.
And this wasn't just any island hopping campaign.
Right.
This was the Japanese mainland.
Yeah.
Did anyone think this was even possible?
Well, that's where the Battle of Okinawa comes in.
Okay.
This took place from April to June 1945, just a few months before the planned invasion. And it gave a really chilling preview of what U.S. forces might be facing.
Okinawa was horrific, wasn't it?
Oh, it was.
I mean,
Really was.
It showed just how far both sides were willing to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Over 12,500 U.S. soldiers were killed at Okinawa,
Wow.
with total casualties around 50,000.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just a military fight.
Right.
You know, we're talking about potentially over 100,000 civilian deaths, too.
God, that's just heartbreaking.
It's truly heartbreaking.
And what's striking to me is that both sides claimed victory at Okinawa.
Yeah.
It seems almost absurd given the devastation.
It does, and it really highlights the different ways that the U.S. and Japan viewed the war.
Okay.
The Japanese saw it as a success because they held off a much larger force for 3 months.
Right.
But for the U.S., it was about gaining a strategic foothold for the eventual invasion.
Right.
So two completely different mindsets clashing
Yeah.
in a really, really brutal way.
So Okinawa was a taste of the potential nightmare to come.
Yeah.
But what was the Japanese strategy going into all this? Did they really believe they could win against the full might of the U.S.?
Their strategy was a high-stakes gamble, to say the least.
Yeah.
They were banking on inflicting such massive casualties on the U.S.
Okay.
that the American public would eventually force their government to negotiate a peace.
Oh, so they were hoping to break the American spirit.
Essentially.
But surely they saw how determined the U.S. was even after Pearl Harbor.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
Even Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor,
Right?
famously admitted that he could only run wild for 6 months after the attack.
Wow.
He knew he'd underestimated the American will to fight.
And tragically, Yamamoto himself became a victim of that resolve.
Yeah.
When U.S. intelligence tracked him down and shot down his plane in 1943.
Right.
But even with his warning, it seems the Japanese leadership clung to this hope of a negotiated peace.
Yeah, it was a miscalculation of epic proportions.
Yeah.
They seemed to believe that if they could just inflict enough pain,
Right.
the U.S. would back down. But they were up against a nation that had fully mobilized for total war.
Yeah.
And that's a really important thing to remember.
And that brings us to the actual planning of Operation Downfall itself.
Okay.
How did this massive operation take shape?
Well, as the war in Europe wound down, the planning for downfall really intensified. It was a two-pronged attack.
Okay.
First, Operation Olympic set for November 1945
Right.
would target the island of Kyushu.
Okay.
Then, in March 1946, Operation Coronet would hit Honshu,
Right.
including Tokyo.
It sounds like something out of a war movie, just on an unimaginable scale.
And you're not wrong about the scale.
Yeah.
We're talking about over 40 aircraft carriers.
Wow.
24 battleships,
Jesus.
hundreds of destroyers,
Yeah.
and more than 675,000 troops in the first wave alone.
Just the first wave.
Just the first wave.
Good Lord.
To put that into perspective, the D-Day landings in Normandy involved around 156,000 troops.
Wow.
So you're talking about...
It boggles the mind.
It really does.
Just thinking about the logistics involved in moving all of that.
And on top of that, the 8th Air Force, which had been pounding Germany into submission in Europe, was being shifted to the Pacific.
Wow.
Armed with B-29 bombers.
So they were just throwing everything they had at this...
The U.S. was throwing everything it had at this invasion.
Yeah.
It was going to be the big one.
And how was Japan preparing to face this onslaught?
They knew it was coming.
Right.
They reinforced their home islands with troops from Manchuria and Korea, and they were digging in, ready for a fight to the death.
Wow.
But even with all that preparation, the casualty estimates were utterly terrifying.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
What kind of numbers are we talking about here?
Well, internal U.S. military planning documents were projecting 720,000 American casualties.
Wow.
By March 1946.
That's more casualties than the U.S. suffered in all of World War II up to that point.
Exactly.
It's insane.
And that's a best-case scenario. Some strategic analysis put the potential U.S. death toll as high as 1.2 million.
Wow.
With 5 to 10 million Japanese killed.
God, it's just almost beyond comprehension.
It really is.
Those numbers.
Yeah, and those numbers align with what Japanese leadership was preparing their own people for.
Really?
They estimated up to 20 million casualties.
Jeez.
A quarter of the entire population of Honshu.
Knowing that my father was prepared to be part of this invasion just makes these figures all the more horrifying.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
It's hard to fathom the scale of loss that was avoided.
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, they were literally preparing for a national suicide.
That's a chillingly accurate way to put it.
Yeah.
And think about the kind of fighting that the U.S. troops would have faced.
Yeah.
You know, the Japanese defenses were formidable.
Right.
Beaches fortified. Civilians trained to fight with bamboo spears.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Even children prepared to die for the emperor.
God.
It was a level of fanaticism that the world had rarely seen.
And we can't forget about the kamikaze attacks.
Oh, yeah.
Which were so devastating at Okinawa.
Absolutely.
I mean, they were expecting those to be even more intense during downfall.
Right.
God, it must have felt like fighting an enemy that had completely embraced death.
It's a truly haunting picture.
Yeah.
And it raises an important question.
Yeah.
Did the U.S. really have any other options?
Right.
Was Operation Downfall unavoidable?
That's where the atomic bombs come into the picture, right?
Right.
But I've always heard that their use was also about keeping the Soviets out of Japan.
That's a common misconception.
Really?
Yeah, while it's true that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were already locked in this growing rivalry, the decision to use the bombs wasn't solely driven by that.
Okay.
Agreements made at Yalta and earlier conferences had already outlined Soviet involvement in the Pacific War.
Okay.
Primarily focusing on Manchuria and Korea, Stalin had promised to join the fight against Japan 3 months after Germany's defeat.
Right.
And he kept that promise.
So the idea that the bombs were dropped primarily to block Soviet influence is a myth.
Yes, historians have largely debunked that theory.
Oh.
The Soviets were already going to be involved.
Right.
The real question was whether the U.S. could force Japan to surrender.
Right.
Before the Soviets gained a foothold in the Japanese home islands.
Right.
And of course, there was the terrifying prospect of those projected casualties for Operation Downfall.
So President Truman had to weigh the horrors of the bombs against the potential horrors of a full-scale invasion.
Yeah.
What an impossible situation.
Absolutely. Truman, who served in combat himself during World War I,
right,
understood the human cost of war firsthand.
Yeah.
His decision to use the atomic bombs has to be seen within that context.
Yeah.
He was facing a choice between two incredibly terrible options.
It really makes you question the entire idea of victory when the potential costs are so high. Like, was there any way to win that wouldn't have resulted in just mass death and suffering?
It's a question that historians continue to debate. And it's worth considering another perspective on this, one that really resonated with me from the podcast.
Yeah.
James Michener,
Right.
the author of Tales of the South Pacific, was a Quaker.
Okay.
And his letter reflecting on the atomic bombings and the potential horrors of invasion offers a really powerful moral lens, I think, on the situation.
What did Michener have to say about it?
Well, he struggled with the decision, as many did.
Yeah.
He later questioned the necessity of the second bomb on Nagasaki.
Right.
But he maintained that he could never criticize Truman for using the first bomb, given what was known about the potential carnage of an invasion.
It highlights just how complex these decisions were. There are no easy answers, just terrible choices.
And that's the key takeaway here. War forces us to confront incredibly difficult moral dilemmas.
Right.
And those dilemmas don't disappear just because the fighting stops.
Yeah.
You know, the repercussions of those choices echo through history, shaping the world we live in today.
And in this case, it's the choice not to invade that might be the most significant.
Yeah.
The atomic bombs officially ended the war.
Right.
But as the podcast host pointed out, the decision to avoid downfall might have been the real turning point.
That's a really thought-provoking idea.
Yeah.
If Operation Downfall had gone ahead, what would the world look like today?
It makes you question everything we think we know about the end of World War II.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that history is never as simple as the textbooks make it seem.
Right.
You know, there are always layers of complexity and competing perspectives.
And that's why deep dives like this are so important.
Yeah.
They force us to look beyond the surface and grapple with the nuances of history. They challenge our assumptions and make us ask the tough questions.
Yeah. It really makes you realize that, you know, we often focus on the dramatic events like the atomic bombings.
Right.
But it's the decisions made in the shadows, like choosing not to invade, that can have the most profound impact.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the power of really digging into history, right? We uncover these turning points that often get overlooked. And in this case, it's a turning point that saved millions of lives, both American and Japanese.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to imagine what the world would be like if Operation Downfall had actually gone ahead.
Right.
Would Japan even be the same country today?
It's hard to say.
Would the U.S. have emerged from the war as the superpower it became?
Yeah, those are questions we can only speculate on. But what we do know is that downfall would have left a devastating mark.
Yeah.
On both nations and on the world as a whole.
For sure.
The sheer scale of death and destruction is just difficult to comprehend.
Gianni Greco's book, Hell to Pay, really opened my eyes to this side of the war, a side that often gets overshadowed by the atomic bombs. You know, it's a must-read, I think, for anyone who really wants to understand just how close we came to a truly catastrophic event.
Yeah, his work is essential because it forces us to confront the harsh realities of war and its lasting impact.
Yeah.
It doesn't shy away from the complexities and the moral dilemmas.
Right.
It makes us think critically about the choices made by leaders
Right.
and the consequences that those choices have for generations to come.
It's been a real journey, hasn't it?
It has.
A deep dive.
I shifted my whole perspective on the end of World War II.
Me too.
Yeah.
So what's the takeaway here for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the decisions made during wartime have ripple effects that extend far beyond the battlefield.
Right.
You know, the choices made, the lives lost, the trauma endured, they all shape the world we live in today.
Yeah.
And it's up to each of us to learn from the past, to engage with history, and to strive for a future where such horrific conflicts are never repeated.
Well said. And as always, there's so much more to explore. I encourage everyone to check out Gianni Greco's book, Hell to Pay.
Yeah, great book.
And to keep diving deep into the stories that have shaped our world.
Absolutely, and never stop asking questions. That's how we learn and that's how we grow.
That's right.
Until next time, keep exploring.